You're listening to the Paranormal Peeps on the Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of indie podcasts with the Darkcast Network.
We have cookies. Between the realm of the dead and the journeys of the living, join Josh, Jamie, and Elisa as they delve into the vast world of the paranormal and breathe life back into the history of the departed.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Paranormal Peeps podcast. I'm Josh.
And I'm Jamie.
And Elisa is on hiatus at the moment.
Yes.
She's just not feeling very well.
No, this crud that goes around, it's bad. And I'm sure our listeners either know somebody or are going through it themselves or have gone through it.
Yeah.
I know that's how we ended the year in December. Boy, that was a rough one.
Yeah, we had it in the year sick as a dog.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Took me weeks to get better.
Took you to the new year.
Yeah, pretty much.
So
it's going around.
We just want to say welcome to season 4, everybody.
Woohoo! See, I can't believe we're on season 4.
I know. It's hard to believe.
I'm sitting there. I was counting back earlier thinking, are we really? No, we couldn't be. But yes, alas, we are on season 4.
We are.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe.
It is.
But we want to say thank you all for, staying with us on this journey. If you've been here since season 1 or before. And for everyone who's
season
new.
1, there was no before season 1.
There wasn't. Well, I mean after.
Or if you came in after.
Yeah, that's what I meant. And if you're new to the program, welcome. And we have got a very intriguing story for you guys today. Probably one that is terrifying for most people, aside from the haunting part of it.
Yes, but before we get into that, I do want to say that we will be recording our year in review for 2023 soon.
Yes.
We were hoping to get that done and have it air first as our first episode of this year. But unfortunately, Lisa is under the weather and it, when one gets it, everybody starts to get it in the house.
Yep.
So it made its rounds. And so until she's available to do the year in review, we decided that we'll just go ahead with this story today.
Exactly.
But I hope you tune in for our year of review and what's coming up and what we're hoping for, because we went to a lot of really cool places.
We did.
In 2023.
We did.
So
that's going to be a great episode when it comes out.
I think so.
So I think a lot of people have a fear of flying or an apprehension of flying.
Yeah, me.
Right? And what is the worry? Like, why are we scared of flying?
Well, because it's so high up.
Right?
Nobody wants to fall like a rock out of the sky.
Exactly. So we're like, the most terrifying thing about flying, for those who are scared of it, is the worry of crashing.
Yes.
And that is what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, goody.
We are going to talk about the Eastern Airlines Flight 401.
Yes. And surprisingly, not a lot of people, or at least not a lot of people that I know, have heard about this.
That is because it crashed in 1972.
Yeah, so probably most of our listeners were not even born.
The hosts weren't even born.
6 years too early it happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Aircraft 310 was one of a dozen L-1011s Lockheed had delivered to Eastern Airlines that year, and it was one of the best of the bunch. While the fleet was being built by the Lockheed California company, Rolls-Royce, the manufacturer of the engines, faltered under the weight of the development costs and went bankrupt.
How that could happen.
Yes, it can. Well, of course, when something like that happens, it throws the whole project behind schedule and into disarray. When the new airplanes finally did start being delivered to Eastern Airlines during the spring of 1972, the new planes were full of bugs, particularly the advanced new engines. So the new L-1011s were consistently and constantly being taken out of service for maintenance during that winter. Which is obviously Eastern's busiest season of the year.
Of course.
So the aircraft 310, however, seemed to have fewer bugs than her sister ships. Lockheed had delivered it on August 18th, and Eastern put it into service on August 21st. So we're going to jump forward just a little bit to December 29th.
Okay.
And it had been flying for only 4 months, 1 week, 2 days.
So not long.
Not long at all.
Yeah.
Maintenance had been regular and frequent, with the current flight log noting only minor problems. Like on Christmas Eve, for example, the first officer's Mach meter was found to be reading 0.006 too low.
What's a Mach meter?
How fast you're traveling.
Okay.
So, I mean...
So it was off.
It was off.
But that could be deadly in a lot of things, just being slightly off.
It can be. That's why it was replaced.
Yes.
More significantly, it would turn out, was the fact that there hadn't been any entries in the logs for the past 60 days complaining of trouble with the landing gear. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Aha.
Although Aircraft 310 had made 502 landings, including the one that brought it into JFK earlier that evening. So the flight that it was on, it's a normal flight from New York to Miami, Florida.
Okay.
So the engineer and second officer for the flight, 401, was Donald Lewis Repo. I think it's how you pronounce his name.
Is it repo or repo?
It's REPO. So it could be both ways.
Yeah. I've heard it both ways.
Exactly. A man who had gone to sleep earlier that night before because he had been trying to shake a cold. Repo was 51 years old and had been employed by Eastern Airlines for 25 years. Just short of half of his life.
Dang.
He was a native of Massachusetts, now living in Miami. That morning, he had gone to the bank and then left for the airport around noon, flying to Tampa, where he boarded aircraft 310 to work flight 164. Now, he and the same crew would fly back to Florida as flight 401.
Okay.
So it's common when flights go one way or the other, they change their numbers, the flight numbers. But the aircraft number is always the same, which we never see.
Right.
At 7:43 that evening, operating as Flight 164, the Whisper Line N310EA touched down at JFK after flying in from Tampa. The crew made just 2 small entries on the log sheet. The tail skid light came on several times during the trip, and the pressure was low in the crew's portable oxygen bottle. While the plane was on the ground at JFK, the tail skid accumulator was serviced and the oxygen bottle replaced.
Okay.
So very standard, right? At 7:30 p.m., Eastern's flight dispatcher at JFK cleared the airplane for a 9 p.m. night coach departure to Miami as Flight 401. So everything's routine so far, which, let's face it, that's how you want your flights to go.
Always. Always want everything routine.
Yep.
Yep.
So one of the flight engineer's duties is to get on board early before the captain and the first officer and run through a series of checks. So before the air conditioner can even be turned on, the flight engineer has to make sure like the flight deck is equipped with spare light bulbs, a first aid kit, rain repellent, smoke goggles, a hand axe, and so on.
A hand axe.
In case you got to chop wood for the engines. Feed the fire.
Yeah, you better feed that fire.
Repo would also fill out the takeoff data card, which had to match the weight limits on the manifest. The manifest listed 9 passengers in the forward cabin and 140 aft, or in the back.
Yeah.
So a total of 153 in all. In fact, there would be 160 on board. For balancing purposes, it was assumed that each passenger weighed an average of 170 pounds.
Sorry. Okay.
Look, they just looked at their driver's license.
Well, and this was back in 1972.
Yes.
So, okay.
Before McDonald's was super popular.
Oh, and McDonald's has always been popular.
No, that's true. Which figured out to be a total payload with luggage and freight of not quite 35,000 pounds. That's a lot of weight.
That is.
Despite the enormous quantities and that there was an error counting the passengers, the manifest was meticulously detailed. To the 250,000 pound operating weight of the airplane was added 400 pounds. So it's like, hey, it's not quite right, so let's just make it correct.
Okay.
This was for 2 additional men who would occupy the flight deck jump seats during the flight. Warren Terry, a co-pilot, and Angelo Donadio, a maintenance specialist. Both of whom were off-duty airline employees who were deadheading, which it's slang for hitching a free ride to go to your next duty assignment.
Yes. Which they often did.
Yep. The flight was to be in the capable hands of Captain Robert Alban Loft. Now, Loft was a tall, trim 55-year-old and had been flying Eastern Airlines since the days of Eddie Rickenbacker.
Who dat? No, I've heard the name, but I am not familiar with who he is.
He's a famous guitarist.
Okay.
In fact, there's a guitar named the Rickenbacker.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
With 32 years of seniority, he was ranked 50th amongst the airline's 4,000 pilots. So, needless to say, he was
good.
He was good. He had spent the morning working in his yard, which adjoined a golf course in Plantation, Florida. And now, just shortly before 9 p.m., the first officer, Albert John Stockstill, slid into the co-pilot seat on the right side of the flight deck. Bert Stockstill, 39 years old, was a former Air Force flyer. A native of Louisiana who now lived in Miami, Stockstill had even more flying time in the new L-1011 than Loft.
Oh, wow.
A solid, dark-haired man, he slept late and then spent the remainder of the morning in his home workshop building a light airplane.
Okay.
Which is kind of common for pilots. Like, they like to build their own hobby crafts.
Of course. I mean, I probably would.
Right? Together, the crew started the L-1011's engines. Outside, the off lights blinked out, warning the ground crew that the airplane was about to come to life. Repo turned on the fuel pump. Turning number 2, the pilot said as he depressed the start switch. Like a multi-million-dollar pinball machine, the instruments winked awake with colorful lights, first green, then amber, setting in motion a series of terse 1- and 2-word functions. Valve open, push, oil press, on, enrich. Finally, at 9:20, word came from the tower that it was Flight 401's turn to take off. Once on the runway, Stockstill released the brakes, applied thrust, and aircraft 310 rolled forward, gathering speed down the runway for more than a mile. It doesn't ever seem that long when you're on the runway, does it?
No.
It's like, quick and up you go.
That's right. It's a little intense.
It is. Loft rested his hands on the thrust levers with all the assurance of a man who had flown for 29,000 hours.
Dang, dude.
I know.
That's a lot.
As captain, his was the final authority as to whether to proceed or abort the takeoff. He decided go. The white jet inched upward toward the night of stars. 185 tons of metal, kerosene, and humanity was airborne.
See, it's lines like that make me not want to fly. That line just scared the ever-loving crap out of me. And I don't know why.
Because that's a lot of 185 tons.
Yeah, of metal,
kerosene, and humanity.
Yeah, see, no.
So, Flight 401 flew south over Norfolk, Virginia, then followed Jet Airway 79 to Wilmington, North Carolina, and thereafter was over water. The flight would normally have passed east over Jacksonville, Florida, at a point 155 miles out to sea, passing a latitude along which lay, on the other side of the world, Cairo and Shanghai.
Yeah.
However, on this night, air traffic control was able to release some airspace east of Jacksonville, vectoring all the Miami area flights, so they wound up west of Barracuda, an invisible navigation checkpoint over the ocean. A computer-stored flight plan would bring the Great White Whisper Line inland over West Palm Beach, and then south to Miami. A long, dense galaxy of lights glittered on a north-south axis between two black voids, the Atlantic Ocean and the Everglades. Among the passengers, the very size of the L-1011 imposed anonymity. On Flight 401, an unexpected factor made it seem even larger than it was. Especially during the holidays, night coaches to Miami were usually filled up. This flight had been booked solid, but Evidently, some people had made last-minute plans, and even with 160 passengers on board when the doors closed, 68 empty seats remained.
Oh, that's surprising.
Yeah. And they sat, strangers, some alone, some in pairs. A woman with salt and pepper hair wore a knit dress with gold frogs on her belt. Her name was Evelyn de Salazar. She managed a Manhattan art gallery. In a small box tucked under her seat was her constant companion, her white poodle. Mark Lissay, 21, a University of Miami student, headed back to class after the holidays. Ethel Jackson, 64, a housekeeper from Liberty City, brought her white uniform in a carry-on bag. Rose Cashman, 57, of New York, sporting a mink coat. All would be dead in a few hours.
Oh.
In row 16, Gustavo and Xiomara Casado were flying to Miami to show relatives their new baby girl. 2-month-old Christina slept in her mother's arm wearing a pink dress. Gerald Solomon, 24, was a nervous smoker who had still managed to make his pack of Territons last 2 days. He had purchased a non-smoking ticket, but while on board found a seat in the last row reserved for smokers. Yes, you still could smoke on airplanes in that day.
Yeah, how things have changed. But...
Right? It was a window seat on the right side, just forward of the wing. Despite that, this was a pleasure trip. He was going to Miami to see his girlfriend and visit a former college roommate. He sat down and went right to work. He was a buyer of gimbals. I always knew retailing was what I wanted. I got right into it out of school and was pretty successful, and I got a nice salary. For a brief time until a friend got promoted, he was the youngest buyer at gimbals. His goal in life, he would say later, was to be successful financially and live a nice and easy, comfortable life. To that end, he had brought computer printouts of his trip to Miami. He was rotating stock that might be sitting in the store not selling. Jerry wore a gold Star of David his mother had bought him a few weeks earlier while in Israel. It was funny. She knew I didn't want to wear anything around my neck. All I wanted was a chain. And she said, I bought this star. If you want it, wear it. Fine. If you want to hold it for your children, fine. And I said, Mom, if it would make you happy, I'll wear it. Joseph Popson was a tired but happy soon-to-be PhD in English, returning to Florida after attending the Modern Language Association conference in New York. He settled in for the journey, digging into his paperback of The Exorcist.
Oh my goodness.
Quietly during the flight, Edward Ulrich proposed to Sandra Burt, and she accepted. He was 44, fair-haired, and balding, a big man who used to play college football. She was 32, and as slight as he was large. They both lived in Seymour, Connecticut, where he was a salesman for a copper company, and she was a secretary at a bank. I thought you'd like to see this, he said, reaching into his pocket, producing a diamond ring. She looked at the ring, smiled, and said thank you. They laughed and drank a champagne cocktail. It was ironic that the flight had more than 6 empty seats. For when they booked, they were told the only seats available were in first class.
Oh, jeez.
Bert bought the tickets anyway. He and Sandra boarded the plane early and sat near the front in seats 4A and 4B. Directly ahead of them were a row of seats in the first class lounge, where there were several additional empty seats and a buffet of cheese and crackers. To the right were more empty seats, and behind them, an airplane carrying 176 people. Yet Ed and Sandra were very much alone.
Interesting.
Right? So immediately after takeoff, Warren Terry, the deadheading pilot who occupied one of the jump seats in the cockpit, moved to an empty seat in first class. Obviously, he's like,
Well, yeah, if so many are open,
why not?
why are you going to sit in these squished little seats in the very tail?
Exactly.
I wouldn't.
This left 4 passengers in the flight deck for the remainder of the flight. The first officer and co-pilot, Bert Stockstill, flew the plane. Bob Loft, the captain, operated the radio. This was normal procedure for Eastern Airlines. Pilot and co-pilot customarily flew alternate legs of the flight. One pilot flying and the other assisting. Behind Stockstill sat Donald Repo, the flight engineer. The fourth person in the cockpit was Angelo Donadeo, the occupant who wasn't there in a working capacity. Donadeo was no stranger to the L-1011. However, he had been Eastern Airlines maintenance manager in Miami, and since September he had worked as a technical supervisor specifically concerned with troubleshooting the new L-1011 fleet. Friday morning, he had been in New York examining an L-1011, which was having engine trouble. That done, he was anxious to return to Miami in order to close on a new house. Unlike Terry, Donadeo chose to stay in the cockpit. There was not a great deal of action in the cockpit for Donadeo to observe, however. So once the plane was out of the New York area, the weather was good. Stockstill put the aircraft on autopilot and dimmed the cockpit lights to provide better visibility of the night sky outside. For almost the entire trip, a DC-10 could be seen ahead of the L-1011. The cockpit radio speakers were turned on, so even without headphones, it was possible to listen to the conversations between Loft and the air controllers, as well as the conversations between the different planes in the sky. It's their form of news radio.
I suppose it is.
So just ahead of Flight 4001, National Airlines Flight 607 was experiencing landing gear difficulties as it approached Miami International Airport. So at 11:19, the north arriving radar operator in Miami's air traffic control tower gave Flight 607 its final approach course. The pilot responded, "Okay, that's maintain 10. You might be advised we're going to need an extended pattern down. We're going to have to crank down our gear." 1 minute later, National 607, with the light indicating a hydraulic leak, radioed the controller, "You might as well run out the fire trucks." The man on Flight 401's flight deck listened to their fellow pilot on board the national plane as it dealt with its troubled gear. With the emergency equipment rolled out onto the field near the runway 9 right, in anticipation of National 607, Eastern 401 was assigned the other parallel runway 9 left.
So now the flight gear that 607 was having issue with, is that the one that's on the nose of the plane? Near the nose of the plane?
They didn't say.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
They were having landing gear trouble.
I'm going to guess it was the nose of the plane.
I kind of had that same feeling when I was reading through it, is that it was the nose of the plane.
Yeah.
So from his jump seat behind the captain, Donadeo looked out a side window and noticed they were making a west to east approach. The plane was crossing the Palomero Expressway, a major highway just west of the airport. It was then that Donadeo became aware of a problem. Stockstill was landing the plane. No nose gear, he said. The flat position warning horn honked. From this point on, the cockpit would periodically be filled with the din of various warning signals, as well as the blaring voices from the radio speakers. I gotta raise it back up, Loft said. Dang it. Now I'm gonna try it down one more time.
Okay, so so they try to lower it.
He lowered it.
Okay, it lowered.
And there's a light that's supposed to turn on.
Okay.
That says the landing gear are down.
Right, and it didn't turn on.
It didn't turn on.
So they raised it.
So he's like, I got to raise it again.
Right.
So he's like, I'm going to try it down one more time.
Okay.
All right, said Stockstill, but his voice was almost covered by the much louder sound of an altitude alert horn. For one granting moment, both horns sounded. Then the flat position warning horn became still. Well, Stockstill said in a calm voice, want to tell him we'll take it around and circle around and fart around?
Okay.
At 11:34 p.m., Loft spoke into the radio. Tower, this is Eastern 401. It looks like we're going to have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet. Loft referred to the 1-inch square light on the lower right side of the center instrument panel that indicates the nose gear is down and locked in position for landing. The light should have been on at this point, but remained unlit. From the radio speaker, the local controller said, Eastern 401 Heavy, Roger, pull up. Climb straight ahead to 2000 and go back to approach control 12.86.
Okay, so circle back around.
Circle back around.
Yes.
Okay, going up to 2000, 128.6, Loft replied. On an internal comms channel, the tower controller called down to the approach radar controller. Eastern 401 Heavies coming back to you. Runway ahead, 2000, unsafe nose gear. So at this point, everyone's just kind of communicating that we got to try this again.
Right. So here's my question. Do they not, like when you watch movies about airports and people in the control tower at the airport, you've seen before where they go up to the window, they pull out one of those high power binoculars and they look at the plane that's incoming?
Yes.
Could they not do something like that to see if the nose gear was actually at least down?
If it wasn't 11:34 at night, I'm sure they could have.
Yeah. Yeah, see? Dang.
Yeah.
Because it makes you wonder.
Right.
Was it really down?
Exactly.
Was something wrong with the light? But
Yeah.
it was actually down and locked in place?
I know.
So.
Curious.
Mm-hmm.
So the approach controller, having been dealing with National 607's gear problem, chuckled on the intercom. He's like, I can't. I only need one more of these. So he's like, I got one more of these to deal with.
Yeah.
You know, another plane with a gear problem. And of course, it's like the next plane that's supposed to land.
Right. That would be a little frustrating, wouldn't
Yes.
it?
It'd be super frustrating. The plane had dropped below 1,000 feet, homing in on runway 9 left. 22 degrees, gear up, Stockstill said, reaching for the landing gear handle. However, Loft suggested, put the power on first, Bert. That a boy. Leave the gear down until we find out what we got. Donadeo observed that although Stockstill was flying the plane, Loft applied the power to the throttles at this point. The plane began to pull out of its descent. So from behind Loft and Stockstill, Repo offered, do you want me to check the lights or not? Loft told him, yeah, check it. Repo's test failed to illuminate the small square light. Stockstill thought that the light assembly might not be properly seated in the fixture.
Okay, so it was askew a little bit, so it wasn't a connection.
Right. He's like, Bob, it might be the light, he said. Could you jiggle the light? He's like, okay. Going up to 2,000 feet, Loft said, into the radio as the jet began to climb. 40 seconds later, Stockstill commented, we're up to 2,000 feet. You want me to fly it, Bob? Loft came back with a question. What frequency did he want us on? He's like, 128.6, answered Stockstill. He's like, I'll talk to him, Loft said. He would continue to operate the radio, and Stockstill would fly the plane.
Okay.
Now, Repo, standing behind Stockstill, looking over his shoulder, asked, is it right above that red one? Is it not? Loft looked ahead. Yeah. Oh, I can't get it in. I can't get it in from here. The troublesome light was on the co-pilot side of the center panel, closer to Stockstill. But Stockstill was flying the plane, so Repo would be the next to try and remove it. He's like, I can't make it pull out either, he said. So at 11:35 p.m., Loft radioed the approach controller to report their position. All right, approach control, Eastern 401. We're right over the airport here and climbing to 2,000 feet. In fact, we've just reached 2,000 feet, and we've got to get a green light on our nose gear. The controller called back to give Flight 401 new heading information. Eastern 401, roger. Turn left, heading 360, and main 2,000 feet. Vectors to 9 left, final. So, go out further.
Yeah.
Loft acknowledged the new heading, turned left, and maintained 2,000 feet. The plane began to make a U-turn, swinging first to the north and then slowly around until it was pointed away from the airport and out toward the Everglades. And then Loft says, put that plane on autopilot here.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Stockstill complied. See if you can get that light out, Loft told him.
So they're still trying to pull that light out.
So they're trying to get the light out.
Yep.
Back in the passenger cabin, some people noticed that they were turning. As the plane circled, Ruiz, seated in the back of the plane, walked over to the flight attendant, Pat Geisels, and wondered why the aircraft was flying away from the city lights. Pat was flipping through the pages of Family Circle magazine. glancing at an article called How to Beat the Holiday Blues. She looked up at Mercy and said, "Oh, Mercy, stop complaining. It's the holidays. If we're a little late, it's overtime," Ruiz recalls. Stockstill finally managed to extract the light fixture from the instrument panel. Inside the plastic cube were two small light bulbs called peanut bulbs. Donadeo glanced across the flight deck and saw Repo examining the fixture. He did not see the flight engineer remove the old bulbs and insert new ones, even though there were spare bulbs on board.
Okay, why?
Exactly. Why? The fixture was replaced into the socket sideways. "You've got it in there sideways then," Loft said. "Nah, I don't think it will fit. You got to turn it 1/4 to the left." Inserted sideways, the fixture had jammed and the light was still off.
Oh, jeez.
There were other ways to confirm that the gear was down, and Loft chose one of them. He turned to Repo and said, "Hey, get down there and see if the nose wheel's down." By down there, Loft was referring to the forward avionics bay, a space beneath the flight deck, more commonly called the hellhole.
Yeah. You pull up the little square cover and down you go.
Yeah, into the nose of the plane.
Into the nose of that plane.
So the bay was accessible through a small square trapdoor on the floor of the cockpit. And I'm sure it's pretty tiny in there too. Inside the hellhole was an optical sighting device which could be used to view the landing gear itself. Meanwhile, Stockstill was still trying to remove the jammed light assembly. "You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do with it. It hangs out and sticks." He turned aloft as Repo was entering the hellhole. "This won't come out, Bob. If I had a pair of pliers, I could cushion it with that Kleenex." Repo paused on his way down. "I can give you pliers, but if you force it, you'll break it. Just believe me." "Yeah," Stockstill said. "I'll cushion it with some Kleenex." Loft was losing patience with the effort to remove the jammed light. Again, he ordered Repo into the avionics bay. "To hell with this," he said. "To hell with this. Go down and see if it's lined up. That's all we care. Mess around with this 20-cent piece of light equipment. We got to get on this."
Yes. And that's the clean version because the other version, and I get it though. He's getting impatient.
He's frustrated.
He's probably starting to think, we got to get this figured out soon, like now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those colorful words sometimes appear.
and maybe he just had that kind of a mouth.
Maybe. I don't know. But I think under the same circumstances, can I honestly say that I wouldn't have used that same kind of language? No, I cannot.
Yeah. The cockpit voice recorder picked up the sound of laughter. It was clear that the crew viewed the malfunction not so much as an emergency, but more as an annoyance.
Sure.
At 11:38 p.m., Loft calmly spoke into the microphone to the controller. "Eastern 401 will go out west a little further if we can get here and see if we can get this light to come on here."
Okay, but I thought they weren't going to screw with the light anymore. He told, go down in the hellhole and see what we got here.
Yeah, but he's talking to...
Can't you not crank that landing wheel down in the front by going down into that hole?
I believe there's a way to do it.
Yes, I do too. To manually do it.
Yeah. So the controller responded, "All right, we've got you headed westbound there now, Eastern 401. It was now 11:38 at the airport. National Flight 607, the plane which had experienced landing gear problems, was given final clearance to land on the runway, 9 right. Fire trucks were standing by. Unlike 401's faulty light, National 607's problem was seen as a real emergency. Meanwhile, Loft and Stockstill continued to discuss the light fixture. "Have you ever took it out of there?" Loft asks. "Hadn't until now." "Put it in the wrong way, huh?"
Oh my.
"Looks square to me," Stockstill said. While Flight 401 was flying over the Everglades, the skies were busy with other flights. Avionica 781 took off from Miami's International Airport on 9 left, followed by Eastern 407. Eastern's Flight 111 landed on runway 9 left. West Indian Flight 790 entered a final approach. Immediately behind that plane was LAN Chile Flight 451, and backed up and waiting to land was National Airlines Flight 437. In the midst of all of this holiday traffic, National Airlines Flight 607, the one with the gear problem, landed without incident. And Loft and Stockstill continue to discuss the lamp assembly.
Oh my goodness.
I don't know what is holding that in. Wow. They're so...
It's foul language in there, I know.
Yeah. I don't know
Yeah,
what...
and this is actual communication between...
Yeah, this is their actual flight recorder.
These are their actual words minus the foul language.
Yes.
Of course.
Always something we could have made schedule. An altitude alert sounded its C chord chime for 1 second and stopped. Loft again turned his attention to the backup method of ensuring the gear was extended. We can tell if that landing gear is down by looking at the indices. I'm sure it's down. There's no way it couldn't help but be. I'm sure it is, Stockstill said. It free falls down, continued Loft. The test didn't show that the lights worked anyway, Stockstill offered, referring to Repo's test a few moments earlier. That's right, Loft agreed. It's a faulty light, said Stockstill. He was still attempting to remove the light. Bob, this light just won't come out.
Screw the light.
Right? All right, leave it there, said the captain.
Finally.
Yes. Then Repo reappeared from the hellhole. I don't see it down there. Huh? Said Loft. I don't see it, Repo repeated. Loft told him, you can't see the indices for the nose wheel? There's a place in there you can look and see if it's lined up. I know, Repo said. It's like a little telescope. Yeah? Well, it's not lined up. I can't see it. It's pitch dark, and I throw the little light. I get nothing.
They need a flashlight.
Right? So Loft...
Where's your flashlight?
Exactly. Loft threw a switch on the overhead panel. Now try it. Repo went back down the ladder into the avionics bay. This time, Donadeo followed him.
Is there room for two down there?
There must have been. As Donadeo left the flight deck, he noticed that Stockstill had his right hand on the yoke and was pushing or pulling the light assembly with his left. Loft had loosened or unfastened his lap belt and was reaching across the center control pedestal, attempting to help. The captain's left arm was braced against the top of the glare shield, which is like the windshield.
Yeah.
And he was reaching for the light with his right arm, crossing just forward of the throttles.
What if you accidentally bump something?
Right? At the airport, the approach controller looked at the altitude block listed next to the little blip representing Eastern 401 on his radar screen. The plane was supposed to be at 2,000 feet, but the crisp, green, phosphorescent numerals read 900.
Oh, man.
The controller radioed the plane. Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there? Loft answered, okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in. And then he told Stockstill, clear on left. From the controller came the instruction, Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180. Loft acknowledged, 180. The L-1011 began a gradual left turn. On the radio speakers, the approach control can be heard telling Land Chile 451 to descend to 1,500 feet. The Land Chile pilot acknowledged. We did something to the altitude, Stockstill said. What? We're still at 2,000 feet, right?
No.
Hey, what's happening here? At the airport, the approach controller handled another plane and looked again at the radar screen. On the screen, Flight 401's data block read CST for coast, which is shown when a beacon target is lost or becomes too weak to correlate for 3 sweeps of the radar antenna. He radioed the whisper liner again. And Eastern 401, are you requesting the equipment? There was silence. Eastern 401, I've lost you. On the radar there? Your transponder? What's your altitude now?
0.
Eastern 401, Miami. No answer.
Oh, jeez.
Then, after a few moments of silence and radio static, at 11:43 p.m. came an ominous message from another aircraft in the area. Miami Tower, this is National 611. We just saw a big explosion. Looks like it was out west. I don't know what it means, but I thought you should know.
Oh, man. They know now.
Yep.
You just know.
So the plane,
Man.
yeah, the plane was traveling 227 miles per hour when it flew into the ground.
Because their altitude was all off.
Yep.
Now, why is that?
So what happens on that plane is there's this knob that you adjust for the autopilot that sets it at 2,000 feet.
Yes.
The problem is that once you bump the yoke or move the yoke, it takes it on autopilot.
Yeah, it disengages auto.
But the little indicator that says 2,000 feet, that what autopilot's set at, doesn't change.
I wonder why. I wonder why they didn't make it so it does change.
That was part of the way the plane was built. The problem was that was never actually taught to the pilots.
Well, that's a shame.
Yes.
Ugh.
So that came out after the investigation of the crash, as they were interviewing the experts who built the plane.
Experts, my butt.
Well, I mean, they built it. They know what's going on. The problem
Yeah,
is...
they built it, but they...
The problem is Eastern Airlines didn't train their pilots.
I think there's a long line of people at fault here.
Yes. So the plane was traveling at 227 miles per hour when it flew into the ground. The left wingtip hit first, then the left engine, the left landing gear. Together, they slashed 3 trails through the sawgrass, each 5 feet wide and more than 100 feet long. When the main part of the fuselage hit the ground, it continued to move through the grass and water, disintegrating as it went. From impact to last movement, the whisper line traveled more than 1/3 of a mile.
Wow.
Midway along the path, the plane slewed around until it was sliding backwards. The great white fuselage burst into 5 large pieces and countless fragments. So, here's a few just actual survivor moments from people on board the plane. So when the plane first touched down, it seemed to Anne Connell that it did so in a normal horizontal landing position. Then it lifted again, and hit again. My husband grabbed me. What followed felt like a roller coaster and a wild whip ride. Barry Connell threw his arm around his wife. He noticed that while the first touchdown was light, the second was hard and grinding impact. The nose of the plane slewed clockwise. A fireball rushed through the cabin from the front to the rear, touching the ceiling and extending as low as the tops of the seats.
Dang.
The plane was skidding when Cannell felt a blast of cold air and a wet, inrushing wave of fuel. He knew the plane was breaking up.
Oh.
In the front of the plane, strapped into her seat against the rear wall of the cockpit, Adriana Hamilton felt the entire nose of the airplane rotate violently to the right. She lurched left, but was held by her seatbelt. The lights went out, and she was in darkness. She was wet, she smelled aircraft fuel, and was seized by the fear of fire.
I would be too. There's got to be so many things running through your head.
Exactly. Is this it? I mean, that's what would be going through a lot of people's brain and thoughts, I'm sure. In the extreme rear of the aircraft, sitting in the coach lounge, Beverly Raposa felt the plane bang to the left. She felt herself being shaken like a rag doll. I could see my arms going in front of me from side to side, and I felt my feet also going from side to side. My body was held in tightly by the shoulder harness, but the rest of me was going along with this jolting. She tried to see what was happening. Her view was partially blocked by the service console and a coat closet, but she saw a ball of flame in the cabin. I could see things flying all about me. There was a rush of wind. It sounded like we were in the middle of a tornado. The coat closet disappeared. Nothing was there but open space. Gustavo Casado was sitting in seat 16C with his wife beside him in 16D, and their 2-month-old daughter, Christy, seated on her lap. On impact, we lost Christy. We searched for her in the dark amid the debris for more than 20 minutes.
Oh my.
From what to me seemed as an eternity and finally a miracle. At more than 40 feet away, my wife felt her cry and rushed to pick her up from a mangled twist of wires and bushes.
Felt her cry or heard her cry?
Felt her
She
cry.
said felt her.
She said felt her cry.
Well, thank goodness.
Right? So, to grasp the size of the Everglades and how empty it is, it's necessary to imagine a land nearly half as large as Connecticut, flooded by a foot of water, overgrown with impenetrable sage.
Yeah, and there's critters.
And there's critters. On December 29th, 1972, Robert Marquis and a friend were riding along in an airboat through the dark expanse of the swamp, gigging frogs. Like catching frogs.
Gigging.
He had built the airboat himself a few years earlier. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing like it, he said. There's not a prettier place you can go to get away from people. Which I believe is true. I mean, it's half the size of Connecticut.
Yeah.
By 11:40, Marquis and his friend had caught about 30 pounds of frogs.
Jeez.
He had been working his way east toward the glow of Miami. Now he pulled back on the steer stick and turned the boat north. Then a little northwest. Marquis then noticed lights of a large jet. The plane was flying west, and it seemed very close. So although he couldn't hear the jet over the roar of the airboat's motor, he knew it was very close. He could see the strobe lights flashing at the ends of the wings.
Right.
That's pretty dang close.
That is very close.
Moments later, he saw a ball of fire, an orange glow that just lit up and spread out for about 8,000 feet across the Everglades.
Jeez.
Looked like maybe it went up 100 foot high, just for a short duration of 8 or 10 seconds. He yelled to his passenger, Rayburn Dickinson. That was a plane crash, wasn't it? Yeah, it looked like it. Marquis put his foot on the throttle and started darting across the swamp in the blackness towards where he had seen the flash. He said, when I first started working into the wreckage, I began seeing people, some of them lying in the water, some of them wandering around, walking, but very slowly. I got as close as I could without running over anybody, then I got out. There were dead people everywhere, and everywhere I looked were half-naked people, completely naked. I felt so helpless. The first one I came to was a man who looked like he was about to drown. Looked like both of his legs were broken. Couldn't move. The only thing he could move was his head, and it kept falling into the water. He said, "Help me, I can't hold my breath much longer." So I pulled him up and rested his back and propped his head out of the water. There were lots of people in turned over seats. There were heads in the water. I tried to help the ones that possibly were drowning. After some minutes, Marquis noticed a helicopter in the sky. It was obviously searching for the crash, but it was sweeping in the wrong area. He slogged back to his airboat, got his helmet light, and began swinging it around. So on New Year's Day, Braulio Cortier, a passenger, died in the hospital of his injuries. Searchers finally found the body of flight attendant Stephanie Stonich, still in the Everglades, still strapped in her seat. On Tuesday, the medical examiner and airline agreed for the first time as to the number of survivors and fatalities. 77 souls lived through the crash. 99 bodies had been removed from the swamp.
Oh, jeez.
By this time, however, two of the original survivors, Don Repo and Cortier, had died in the hospital on January 3rd and 1st, respectively. Two more would die later, Louis Bancroft on January 6th and Warren Terry on January 15th. In the end, Flight 401 had carried 176 passengers, and within a month of the crash, the final tally would be 103 victims.
Wow. Devastating.
Absolutely devastating. We just talked about a plane crash, but how does that relate to hauntings? Like, how do we get from plane crash to hauntings?
Right. Well, and the reason we went through all this is because it does play into the hauntings.
It does.
And it makes more sense by going through what we just
went through.
I know it was kind of long, but now we're getting to the haunted stuff.
Yes. So here's the interesting thing about plane crashes, which we never knew this until this part. We all know planes are expensive.
Yeah.
And so if one is taken out of service or crashed, if there are salvageable parts, they will be put and used on other aircraft.
That's right.
Now, the FAA and the engineers and stuff that are doing this, they actually make sure that these things are very safe to go on to these other planes so it doesn't cause additional issues. So there were a few things that were taken away. Some of the pieces were in the galley, which is where the food's prepped, which on these L-1011s is actually in the belly of the plane. There's an elevator, or two elevators actually, that the stewardesses can take down and work in the galley, and then they can put onto these elevators like the loaded trays of food and stuff
and
send up so the other people on top can serve the food.
Yep.
And that's very important because we're going to go over some first account hauntings from some of the flight attendants who were working on other planes that received parts
from the plane that crashed.
Yes.
Flight 401.
Flight 401.
Yes.
So one of the stewardesses on Loft's flight from Tampa was Doris Elliott. Now, some 2 weeks earlier, she had been working a flight from JFK to Orlando when she was hit with what she described as a weird, sick feeling. It was overpowering. In her mind's eye, she clearly saw an L-1011 over the Everglades, coming in on a flight approach to Miami International. It was dark, late at night. She saw the left wing crumble and the fuselage smash into the ground. She heard the cries of the injured. She had to stop work in the cabin and sit down.
Wow. Two
of her friends, flight attendants, immediately came over to her side. They asked Doris what was wrong. She told them she had had experiences like this before, and they had turned out to be almost totally accurate. 4 of her former classmates had been killed at a railroad crossing, and after she had foreseen the accident.
So almost like a premonition.
It's a premonition.
Oh boy.
They asked Doris when this new accident was going to happen. Around the holidays, she told them, closer to the New Year's. It is going to be us. Or is it going to be us? No, Doris said, but it's going to be real close. Doris regained her composure and finally was able to put it out of her mind. In fact, it was completely out of her thoughts when she arrived at Kennedy that December 29th, 1972, shortly after 7:30 that evening. The cockpit crew, Loft, Stockstill, and Repo, went directly to plane 310, and they would begin their pre-check immediately. They were discovered to have a new assigned cabin crew of 10 stewardesses, and they had not yet arrived to handle the full complement of passengers that had been booked. There was not much time left. Flight 401 was to leave at 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. Considerable work had to be done before boarding. In a last-minute switch, Captain Loft's team of stewardesses, including Doris Elliott, was assigned to Flight 401. The originally scheduled cabin crew was flying up to New York from Miami on Flight 26. They were late, and it looked as if there was little chance of reaching JFK for a turnaround on 401. They were a closely knit team and had been enjoying working together during the Christmas month. In fact, just before leaving Miami, they had asked a friend to take a picture of them as a group. They were jovial and relaxed as the picture was taken. One of the stewardess group, whose name is withheld here, had not been in a jovial mood for some 6 months before the picture was taken. She had consulted a psychic medium in the northwest sector of Miami, not far from the airport, and he told her that she was to be in a plane accident before the year was over. She was going to think that she had been killed, but she must have confidence that she was alive, even though all around her there would be total blackness. This scheduled cabin crew arrived at JFK at nearly 8:40 p.m. They scurried off their plane and over to Flight 401, which the standby stewardess had already boarded. There was a congenial exchange of assignment as the original crew took over for Doris Elliott and the others. Her strange premonition didn't enter her mind again at that time.
You know, if honestly, if I had an experience like that where I had a premonition, I don't know that I would be able to get it out of my mind. You know what I mean?
Right?
I don't think I'd be able to get it out of my mind. I would think about it constantly.
Yeah. I mean, how interesting though. There was one premonition and one psychic medium reading
Mm-hmm.
for two different people. One person said had this premonition of a plane crash. Is it going to be us? No, but it's going to be close.
Yeah.
And it was by about
Mhm.
20 minutes. It was
Mhm.
that close. It was going to be them. The other gal, she knew she was going to be in a plane crash, but she would survive.
Right.
So, I mean, that is terrifying. And as before the year's over, it's the 29th of December.
Yeah, there's not much time left.
There's 3 days.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. That's kind of freaky.
Kind of freaky. No, that's terrifying.
Yeah, okay, that's a lot terrifying. There's a book written about this accident. It's called The Ghost of Flight 401. In it, there are flight attendants who decided to talk to the author and give their firsthand accounts of ghostly sightings that happened on the plane.
Yeah.
So one of the flight attendants' name is Ginny, and this is one of her accounts. She said in March of 1973 that she was assigned to an L-1011 flight out of New York to Fort Lauderdale, along with her close friend, Denise Woodruff. It was plane 318. Both of them liked to work in the spacious L-1011, either up in the cabins or down in the service galley, where over 200 meals could be heated in the glass door stainless steel ovens that rimmed both of the sides. That's pretty big.
That's massive.
It was a cozy, quiet area. There was soft illumination coming from the lighting panels that spread across the entire ceiling. Some preferred to work down there because they could be alone with their thoughts as they loaded the carts full of trays on the two skinny elevator platforms and sent them up to the cabin crew above for serving. The elevators would carry either the food carts or two cramped stewardesses. There was less hassle and more privacy down there, away from the incessant demands of the passengers. The flight carrying Ginny and Denise was full, and the service demands were heavy. Denise squeezed into one of the tiny elevators and came down to the lower galley to give her friend Ginny a hand in the galley. In the meantime, Ginny was on her way up to the passenger deck to see if she could help the girls out there. So they just
Switched.
the two elevators passed each other. The main deck, Ginny learned that Denise had gone down to the galley to help her. It took only a couple of minutes for Ginny to get ready to return to the lower bay galley. Unknown to her, Denise was coming up in the elevator as Ginny was going down.
Oh my.
So Ginny was a little surprised not to find Denise there. She thought nothing of it, however, except that she had a strong feeling that Denise was still down there. As she continued her work, the feeling grew. Denise was down there, she was sure. She could feel her presence. It was quite a pronounced feeling. She shrugged it off and continued loading the meals from the ovens on the carts. Although the feeling of a presence in the galley increased. Then Ginny was convinced that she knew the reason. Denise was never above a healthy, practical joke and must be hiding from her. There were several cabinets in the galley. Perhaps Denise was idiot enough to squeeze into one of them for a big surprise sort of thing. Denise decided to wait her out, but now the feeling of the presence of someone else in the room grew until it became almost intolerable. Ginny knew somebody was there in the galley with her. It was an awkward, uncomfortable feeling. She was convinced that she wasn't going to be tapped on the shoulder any minute. She couldn't stop herself from glancing back over her shoulder to avoid it. She laughed at herself, then tried to shrug the whole thing off. It didn't work. Ginny finally gave up. She went over to the cabinets, opening the doors and shutting them again. Denise was nowhere to be seen. As much as Ginny tried to dismiss it, the feeling of a definite presence was growing so strong now that she could feel herself backing against the wall to avoid anyone who might be behind her. She felt silly and ridiculous. Now the feeling of the presence was overbearingly intense. She had never felt anything like this before in her life. A genuine fear gripped her. She had to get to those elevators and get away from the closed-in galley. She had almost paralyzed with fear. She slid against the wall, against the row of ovens, toward the elevator. She couldn't believe the way she was acting. Ginny reached the elevators, pressed the button, and waited with her back against the wall beside the elevators. It seemed to take an endless amount of time for the elevator to arrive. She leapt into it, white and shaking. The ride up seemed interminable, and at the main cabin she pushed open the door and almost knocked over Mitty Darrow, another flight attendant. "Jeannie," she said, "what on earth's the matter with you?" "I can't talk about it," Jeannie said. She felt foolish and ashamed for herself. "Come with me," Minnie told her. She followed Mitty to the back of the plane. Denise was there, and she too was visibly shaken. "You're both more upset than I've ever seen you," Mitty said. She turned to Ginny. "Did the same thing happen to you that happened to Denise?" Ginny was beginning to get more command of herself. "What happened to Denise?" she asked. Denise blurted her story out. When she had gone down in the elevator to the lower galley, Ginny must have been going up because no one was there. When she arrived, she was immediately hit with a cold, very clammy feeling, something she had never felt before. She had waited a few moments for Ginny to return. The feeling grew worse and seemed to be completely overpowering her. She had done the same thing Ginny did later, run for the elevator. Reaching the main deck, she told Mitty Darrow about it and went to the back of the airplane to try to recover. She had no idea that Ginny had experienced the identical feeling. They asked Mitty not to say anything to anyone about the incident, and she agreed.
So it makes me wonder, I mean, for them to be so... Okay, so, when we go out and we investigate,
Yep.
and this doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it does happen where you know when something comes into the room or is like behind you, and when it's unmistakable. For me, it's when it's not something good.
Right.
And it doesn't happen often. But
Yeah, you know.
So for these women, both of them have the exact same experience at different times.
Yep.
Because one was down there, one was not, and then vice versa. And just the feeling, and it left them so shaken. It makes me think it wasn't anything good.
What makes you what it thinks, but then again, we're normal investigators, and we deal with the paranormal all the time.
Okay.
To those who don't deal with it normally, an unknown presence in the room, benevolent or not, can be terrifying because you're
Maybe.
think about it. You're down there working, right? And you just feel someone's behind you,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't know what it is.
Yes, but for that growing dread for it to just build and build to the point to where they're on panic.
Yeah.
Unless it was a spirit that wasn't necessarily bad, but that was trying to, I don't know, get them out of there. I don't know.
It could just be trying to get their attention.
Right. Because it just, I don't know. I guess for me, it's just like a big, huh?
Yeah. So this isn't the only thing that's happened on this plane.
Oh, no, there's lots of things.
So it was only a few weeks after this, Doris Elliott, the lovely flight attendant with the premonition,
Mm-hmm.
she was working in the lower galley of plane 318.
Oh.
Same plane.
Yep.
And Doris knew nothing about Ginny and Denise's experiences. So, because
Right.
no one knew it, no one said anything. So she had nothing to predispose her to anything going on.
Right.
Alone in the galley on plane 318, Doris Elliott suddenly realized that she was experiencing one of those minor kinks when the galley became uncomfortably cold. She kept on working, stacking the freshly heated passenger trays neatly in the service carts. The cold persisted, a damp, penetrating cold. This was strange because, if anything, the opening and closing of the ovens often
been hot.
Often made the galley warmer.
Yeah.
She finally called the flight engineer down to see if he could correct the situation. When he arrived, he agreed the temperature was extraordinarily cold, and they went to check the thermometer. It read 90 degrees, without question. but the cold was still persisting.
You know what's interesting? When they describe it as cold and damp,
Yes,
like the Everglades
exactly. Like the Everglades.
at night.
At
Cold
night.
and damp.
Although she was puzzled, she was sure that the situation could be corrected by maintenance, and he would report the anomaly on landing. In the meantime, the rest of the flight would not take too long, and Doris planned to go to the passenger deck as soon as she finished serving. Except for the distinct discomfort, neither the engineer nor Doris gave the incident any further thought.
Right.
So despite Jeannie's strange experience with Denise, she still had no fear of the galley. So,
I mean, that's good.
Yeah. In fact, she preferred that duty to the necessity of constantly responding to individual passenger demands, which I can get because people can get really demanding, more so than they would even at home.
Oh, especially these days.
Yeah. I mean, this is 1973 too.
I know, but it's more common now.
Yes. So several weeks after her experience with Denise, she was flying routinely on the flight 401 from New York to Miami. She had noted that the craft for the flight she was using was number 318 again. Down in the galley, she was waiting for the elevator doors, ready to send up more food to the flight attendants above. In the peak periods, the elevators were often slow. They would not return down their narrow shaft until the doors on the passenger deck were firmly closed and latched. Jeannie was growing a little impatient. She pushed the button several times to summon the elevators and waited. Then she leaned back against the starboard wall of the plane and rested. To her left was the bulkhead that separated the galley from the section that carried the electrical equipment for the plane. It could be entered by a large, heavy bulkhead door with a small window, the size of a porthole. Out of the corner of her eye, she became aware of a hazy, cloud-like formation just in front of the bulkhead wall. Puzzled, she turned and looked at it. The galley was brightly lit, and she had no trouble in examining it in detail. It was not condensation or steam or smoke. She knew that. It seemed to be at the size of a grapefruit, but it was getting bigger. It was almost pulsating in a strange way, and the shape was more substantive and articulate than smoke. If it had been smoke or even condensation, she would have immediately notified the flight engineer. To make sure, she checked a nearby vent. But there was no condensation anywhere near it. She pushed the elevator door button again and then turned back to look. The cloud was now the size of a slightly elongated basketball. A few inches out from the wall, and it was beginning to form into a thicker, much more solid shape. She was fascinated, transfixed by it. It was still growing larger. She pushed the elevator button harder and turned her face away. Perhaps, she said to herself, if I don't look at it, it might go away. She pushed the button again. The elevator still did not come. She wanted to look and not look at the same time. She could still see the shape out of the corner of her eye. It was more pronounced than ever. She looked again. There was no question about it. It was clearly forming into a face. Half solid, half misty. She heard the elevator door above slam, and the lift began to come down. She pushed the button frantically, even though it was unnecessary now. It seemed to be taking forever to reach her. She just had the elevator reach the lower galley level, and she looked again. It was a complete, clear face now, with dark hair, gray at the sides, and steel-rimmed glasses, now forming clearly on the three-dimensional image. There was no question it was a face, and no question that it was wearing glasses. They were now sharp and clear. This was the final touch. She had been able to try to rationalize the beginnings of the formation by explaining to herself that it had been condensation, even though she knew it wasn't. The steel-rimmed glasses and the clearly identifiable hair removed any uncertainty from her mind. The elevator arrived. She jerked open the door and jumped into it. She was upset and shaking. At the passenger level, she went immediately to the biffy, which is the airline term for the washroom, and tried to regain her composure. It was hard to get herself together. She would be afraid to tell anybody about this. It was too weird, too unbelievable. The first experience was difficult enough, but that was shared with Denise. Now she was alone. She didn't even want to tell Denise. Even when she had seen the eyeglasses form on the already well-articulated face, she knew in her own mind that she was not creating an image of her own.
That would be a little intimidating.
It would be super
When
intimidating.
you're down there alone, you watch this misty, cloudy thing grow
Yep.
and then start to become clearer and clearer until it's very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can make out a face.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how, as an investigator, that would be
That'd be
amazing.
awesome.
Be like, did you get that? Did you see that?
Yeah, but if you were alone, even as an investigator, while there would always be, this is amazing, this is so cool, there's always a little bit of that.
I need to check my pants now.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where your paranormal depends come in.
That's
folks.
right.
Never leave home without them.
Exactly. Or never do a podcast without them.
What? Oh, now come on.
So plain. I've heard it both ways.
Stop making words up, would you?
Plane 318 was undergoing its normal pre-flight check before a turnaround flight back to Miami. The second officer had completed its walk-around. The captain and first officer were in their seats in the cockpit, running through the endless list of details designed to make sure that nothing was overlooked that could affect flight comfort or safety, like those blasted landing lights. In the cabins, the flight attendants were preparing the plane for boarding. The Marriott caterers had already finished loading the food containers in the lower galley and was all set. In a few moments, the passengers were boarded, directed to their seats, and prepared themselves for takeoff. In the first class section, Sis Patterson, the senior stewardess for the flight, was making her routine head count. She found that the count was off by one passenger and went back over the seats to double check. It didn't take long to find the discrepancy. There was an Eastern captain in uniform in one of the seats, and obviously he would be the one who was deadheading back after bringing another plane to Newark. This is a very common thing, and at times the deadhead captains would ride in the jump seat after sitting in the first class cabin. It was still necessary to confirm this, and Sis approached the captain with her list. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, "but are you jump seat riding this trip? I don't have you on my list." The captain did not respond. He stared straight ahead. "I beg your pardon, Captain," she repeated. "I've got to check you off, either as a jump seat or a first-class pass rider. Can you help me?" The captain still would not respond. He continued to stare ahead, acknowledging the flight attendant by neither voice nor gesture. Sis was puzzled. Deanne Boas, the flight supervisor, joined her. She was equally puzzled. The man seemed perfectly normal in all respects, yet he seemed as if he were in a daze. It worried them both. They were somewhat uncertain as to what to do. Finally, Sis went forward toward the flight deck and entered the door of the cockpit. Perhaps the flight captain would be able to get a response where she couldn't. The flight captain was also perplexed. He got up from his seat in the cockpit and came out to the first-class compartment with Sis. There were about half a dozen regular passengers in the immediate vicinity of this deadheading captain. Rather curious about what was going on, the flight captain approached the seat, anxious to get on with this flight. What puzzled him was there was no record of another Eastern captain listed as a jump seat occupant. And apparently the man had no pass for the flight. With both the stewardess and flight supervisor behind him, the flight captain leaned down to address the other captain, then froze.
You recognized him, didn't you?
He recognized him. He said, "My God, it's Bob Loft."
Oh my goodness.
There was silence in the cabin, and something happened that no one in the vicinity could explain. The captain in first-class seat simply wasn't there. He was there one moment and not there the next.
Oh, that's so cool.
I know.
I mean, it would be freaky, yes.
But you're talking about a individual
That you know
is not there, is dead,
he's dead, but there he sits.
and witnessed by 15 people.
Yeah. Wow.
And it's not like, oh, it's just a minute, right? Like it takes a few seconds. I mean, it takes a little bit of time to count everybody.
Yep.
And
then recount.
Then recount. Then talk to the person, get your supervisor, talk to your supervisor. Supervisor comes over,
Talks to the captain.
talks to the captain,
Then they go into the cockpit,
get the flight captain.
bring him out.
So you're talking minutes are going
Yeah.
by. Minutes.
Yeah. Oh, that is something else, I'll tell you.
Same plane. That's the part that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's the same plane.
Yep.
So, flight attendants Denise Woodruff and Doris Elliott found themselves in Newark 3 days after the startling incident in first class on 318. As they prepared to board 318 for their return trip, the first thing they planned to do was look at the logbooks, because they wanted to know what was in there, what was said.
Yeah.
Right? When they opened it up, they noticed something very strange. All of the pages up to and including the date of the incident had been removed, contrary to the general practice. So whatever comments recorded by the captain and crew of that unusual flight were completely gone.
Of course they were.
So Ginny was on cabin duty on flight 26, which was plane 318 again, as it was going to New York. The flight was relatively smooth, except for a minor low-altitude turbulence. Pretty common. After they had passed through it, the plane showed a tendency to roll slightly to the right, then straighten, then roll to the right again. This continued for a considerable time until landing at Kennedy in New York. The plane was checked thoroughly with the hydraulic and electrical control systems carefully tested. No apparent reason for the roll was found. Minor adjustments were made, and plane 318 took off again on schedule from Kennedy to Miami as flight 401. It wasn't long before the plane began the slight roll to the right again, followed by the equally slight recovery motion. It was somewhat annoying, but not really disturbing. Jeannie went about serving the beef eater martinis, the scotches, the cokes from her beverage cart, and a little annoyed about the slight yaw to the right, but not concerned about it. She was approaching the cabin section, situated over the wing area, when a man sitting there called her down the aisle to him. He pointed out the window and said to her, "What is that over the wing?" Ginny bent down and looked out. Out toward the wingtip was a luminous, hazy mass that was definitely not a cloud, because its mass was opaque and it hovered over the wing as it continued moving along with the plane. Ginny watched it with the passenger for some time. They noticed that the mass, about the size of a large piece of luggage, would rise up a few feet off the wing, and as it did, the plane would level out. Then the mass would settle down on the wing, and as it did, the wing would distinctly dip. Then the process would repeat itself over again. After they'd watched it for several minutes, the passenger suggested that Ginny might want to go up and notify the flight engineer. She did so hesitantly. He came back from the cockpit with her and joined the passenger and Ginny to observe it. "It must be a cloud," the engineer said. "It'll go away." The passenger protested. He told the engineer that he'd been watching it for several minutes. The engineer stayed there for some time and was frankly baffled. His only theory was that it was condensation, but he would have thought that thought had a weak theory. He assured them that the plane was perfectly safe in spite of the roll, that he would have it checked out when they landed in Miami. About a half hour later, the plane began rolling to the left.
Switch sides,
continuing in the similar pattern as before. But now, Jenny had reached the point where she was more interested than concerned or worried. When her passenger sitting over the wing section on the left side called her across the aisle, she was almost able to take it as a matter of course. She joined the passenger looking out, and the luminous mass was there again on the other wingtip, and the plane was not rolling as long as it was above the wing. When it came down and sat on the wingtip, the plane would roll. The controls could not correct it. The plane landed safely at Miami, and Jeannie went home to tell her husband Fred about this incident. At least, she was thinking. I didn't even look out for anything unusual until 2 different passengers pointed it out to me.
Wow. That's interesting.
So interesting. I mean, that plane, just 318 itself, had undeniably interesting things happen to it.
Yeah.
And those were like the 3-4 months after 401 crashed.
Yeah.
But the first paranormal pieces happened right after the crash.
Right.
So for months, hunters, poachers, and wildlife enthusiasts started reporting strange, unearthly sights and encounters around the crash site. One person said, I was just frog gigging went. A face looked up at me from below the surface. A woman's face screaming up spooked me silly. Never been back to that place since that moment. Around here, we do our best to avoid that area.
Yeah, that would be quite unnerving.
Wouldn't it?
If you're looking down in a foot of water for frogs and a screaming woman's face comes into focus.
Yeah.
Screaming under the surface.
That would be haunting.
I don't know that I could go back.
I'd be worried it was a person. Like someone had drowned in that foot of water.
Yeah.
For months and years after the crash, the area became a hotbed of supernatural activity. Marfa lights started popping up around the swamp. Specters peered from the gloom into the awestruck eyes of hunters. Things swam below the surface of the swamp. Things dressed in rags and tattered clothes.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Terrifying. That's like
straight out of a movie.
Yeah, that's like horror movie-esque.
Yes.
So in 1973, from JFK Airport, an Eastern Airlines TriStar was boarding for its flight down to Miami. Traveling that morning was one of the airline's vice presidents. As a VIP passenger, he was allowed on the aircraft first and made his way to the first-class cabin. As he moved toward his seat, he noticed a company captain in full uniform and went over to chat.
Of course.
During the ensuing conversation, he suddenly realized he was speaking to Bob Loft.
Oh, jeez.
The apparition quickly disappeared, and the vice president rushed off to find the crew, terrified that it could be an omen that something would happen to this aircraft. A search of the plane was carried out before any other passengers boarded, and there was no sign of the mystery captain.
It seems that when Captain Loft appears, okay,
Yep.
and this is the second report we have, that the minute somebody recognizes who he is,
Yes.
he disappears.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he talked to him. So
Yeah, that's astounding. Did they say what the conversation was?
they did not. Just that he had a conversation with a pilot.
Man, I wish they would have said what the conversation was.
I know.
I would
It'd
have
be so
loved
awesome.
to know.
So a few months later, back at JFK, a crew boarding the same aircraft were surprised to see Loft already sitting at the flight deck. They apparently chatted to the ghost, not realizing who he was, before he vanished right before their eyes. The flight was later canceled as the crew were too shaken to operate.
I mean, I don't blame them.
Again, they talked to him.
Yeah, and nothing was said about what they discussed.
Nothing. I know.
Come
It's annoying.
on.
So on these aircraft, we know that flight engineers do the pre-flight checks before everybody else, right?
Yes.
So on this particular day, the flight engineer was stunned to see an Eastern second officer already in his seat. He immediately recognized him as Don Repo, and the apparition said to him, "You do not need to worry about this pre-flight. I've already done it." Then he disappeared.
Do we trust him though? Wasn't he the one that couldn't get the little bulb out and put it in wrong? And
No, that was the
Oh,
co-pilot.
okay. Okay.
That was the co-pilot. He just had to go down on the hellhole and look, and he couldn't see anything.
Okay.
Which I get. It's dark.
Yeah, it's dark.
Some weeks later, another captain was checking the instruments before a flight from Miami to Atlanta. Staring him right in the face was the unmistakable outline of Repo's face. The captain claimed he distinctly heard the words, "There will never be another crash on an L1011. We will not let it happen."
Wow. Wow.
Right?
What else do you say to that?
There's not much more you can say.
Just wow.
So during another flight from Atlanta to Miami, the flight deck crew were enjoying their meal as they cruised at 39,000 feet. pretty standard. Suddenly, there was a loud knocking coming from the hellhole. So like banging coming up, right?
Mm-hmm.
By now, the ghostly stories had been circulating around the company, and the crew were reluctant to look.
You know, I guess I don't blame them.
I wouldn't be either.
It would be a little
Unnerving.
unnerving.
But the knocking continued, and as the flight engineer opened the hatch, he was horrified to see the face of Repo staring back at him. Terrifyingly, this was where the engineer had been when the Flight 401 had crashed.
That's why I would be terrified.
Yep. So, on Flight 903 had just taken off from JFK en route to Mexico City, right? Stewardess Faye Merriweather was in the galley preparing the meals for the passengers, and she reached for the handle of the oven door. She was horrified to see the face of Don Repo staring back at her. No, not one to panic, she briskly went to get another stewardess and the aircraft's engineer to come and take a look. Sure enough, when they returned, Repo's face was still staring out from the oven. So now it's viewed by 3 people.
It's just keeping warm.
You gotta get cold in the afterlife. You got to stay warm, right?
Right.
Although now it looked like he was trying to say something. Suddenly, all 3 clearly heard the apparition mutter the words, "Watch out for the fire in this plane."
Ooh.
The plane reached Mexico City safely, but on the return leg, problems began with the starboard engine. After an inspection, the aircraft was cleared for takeoff, but as the plane climbed out, the engine failed and backfired several times. It was quickly shut down before it caught fire and returned to the airport. Thankfully, nobody was hurt during the incident, but the crew were understandably very shaken after what they had seen in the oven door.
Well, no kidding. I
Yep.
would be too.
Right?
I'd also be grateful.
Yeah. Very grateful.
Very grateful. Yeah.
Like you're warned, right? He already said, no, there will be no other crashes of these planes.
Yeah.
We will not let it happen.
So
And
he gave the warning.
He gave the warning. Well, is it a warning or a reassurance?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. To be in that moment, and depending on the person who got the message or the people that got the message, everybody could take it differently.
Yep. So later on the same plane, another flight attendant saw an engineer she didn't recognize fixing the plane's oven. She asked another engineer on the flight who the other engineer was, but he told her he was the only one on the flight. Later, the flight attendant recognized the engineer she had seen when looking at photos of Don Repo.
Oh, dang.
He was fixing the plane.
Maybe he was fixing the oven so that there wouldn't be a malfunction and a fire.
Right?
Or explosion or whatever.
Another flight attendant on a flight from New York to Miami opened the overhead storage bin to put a passenger's luggage in there and saw Bob Loft's face staring back at her from the other side.
That
That would be scary.
That would be scary because that's the last place you expect to see anybody. Well, an oven too, but
Yes.
But up in the compartment?
Yeah. An entire cockpit crew claimed they saw Bob Loft sitting among them on another Eastern Airlines flight. They said Loft warned them about some faulty wiring, which was then found and repaired.
Wow.
I know. So we're almost done. We got one more report.
Okay. Lay it on me.
And it's not on an airline. It's not even on a plane.
Okay. Well, now I'm intrigued.
John Repo believed. So he was one of 4 siblings. He was a teenager when his father's plane dropped into the Everglades. He told this reporter in 1997 that there were a lot of coincidences that happened. He said his father came to him one evening on his wedding night. He and his new bride entered their sparkling clean room at a Miami hotel. They had told nobody where they were staying. He opened the closet door, and on the floor was a plastic Eastern Airlines set of wings.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that neat?
Oh, that's so sweet.
So sweet. So neat.
Oh, man.
So despite all of these reportings, all of these stories that have happened, Eastern Airlines candidly dismissed that any of their planes were haunted.
Well, they're going to.
But nonetheless, they removed all of Eastern Airlines 401 plane parts
Yes, they did.
from those planes.
Yes, they did. And then ever since then, there have been no reports of any hauntings.
No hauntings. And unfortunately, Eastern Airlines is out of business.
Yeah. I wonder whatever happened to those parts, though.
Well, some of the parts, like the original floorboard from the flight,
Mm-hmm.
now sits in the the archives at History Miami in South Florida.
Okay.
So it's in a museum, right? Other parts are in Ed and Lorraine Warren's Occult Museum in Kentucky.
I did not know
Connecticut.
that. I did not know that.
Yeah. Isn't that neat?
I mean, yeah, in a sense, I guess. But maybe now this means that like the spirits of like Loft and Repo are at rest.
I hope so. I hope, I mean, I would imagine that they are at rest now. I mean, once those planes no longer fly. Right?
Yeah.
And so that is nice in itself. Although I got to say this, there was a front cabin or lounge area.
Mhm.
There was a rear lounge area.
Yes.
There was an elevator where where the flight attendants could make food.
Yeah.
This was a very nice plane.
Yeah.
Can we have that back?
No, because it costs money. And then, I mean, look at airline tickets now already.
I know.
Can you imagine if they built, a dozen or so of those type of planes again? What that cost would be?
It'd be astronomical.
Yeah.
But they sounded luxurious and comfortable.
I know. But the way everything is so inflated, everything,
Yeah.
it would just be far too.
So what one of those stories was the most intriguing?
They're all intriguing, but I have to say that the ones where Captain Loft would be sitting there,
Yes.
he would be sitting there and people actually had conversations with him,
I know.
or he's sitting there not answering, but the minute that the captain of the current flight comes up to him, bends over to talk to him and recognizes who he is, and then they watch as he just disappears in front of their face.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, that's super intriguing.
It's so intriguing. I think that one, especially the one where there were so many people on board the plane.
That saw it. It wasn't just one person.
Yeah.
It was many.
The other one that I find intriguing is the VP's conversation with Bob Loft. Like,
Yeah.
Again, we don't know what was said or how long this conversation was, right?
But it amazes me that this VP of that airlines did not even recount any of what they had discussed, no matter how long or how short. Was it divulged anywhere? I mean, for me, if I had that experience, I'd be like, yeah, I sat down, there's a pilot there. And so I was just talking to him and he, we talked this and that, I don't think I would not, talk about what was discussed.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was all of these hauntings, all of these incidences occurred over a year and a half while these parts were on these planes.
Yes.
It's a very, very short period of time.
Yeah.
That all of these things happened.
That's a lot. It's quite a bit.
It is so much. But there were not that many L-1011 planes in the fleet. And so, and it seemed like 318 was maybe the most active, or just at least people more willing to talk who flew on that plane.
Who knows?
But
who knows? But I also think it's really cool that Loft warned about a wiring issue.
Yes.
And that they found it and fixed it.
Wiring issue. The fact that the worry about a fire on this plane.
Mm-hmm.
Like, of all places you don't want to get a fire is at 30,000 feet. That's the last place you want a fire.
Well, that's the last place you want anything to go wrong.
Exactly.
If I'm being honest.
Exactly. And it just shows that these two individuals loved so much that this aircraft, and they loved what they did so much that they didn't want anybody else to go through it.
Well, they loved what they did, honey. They didn't love how they passed.
No, you're right.
And that's why they come back is because they don't want that to happen
To anybody
to
else.
anyone else.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
It's super amazing.
Yeah.
So everybody, I really hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fascinating. I know when I found this, I couldn't stop reading about all of this.
Yeah. Well, and they have a book, The Ghost of The Ghost of Flight 401. It also, they have a movie.
They do.
There is a movie. Of course, it's an older movie, but, might be cool to go check out.
Who was in that?
I don't remember.
I think it was Ernest Borgnine.
I think so.
Yeah. Because it's an old movie.
It's an older movie. But there is so much. For those of you familiar with like Mr. Ballin, he does this one, tells the story. You can watch it on YouTube.
Yep.
There's a lot. In fact, when I was looking, I found so much
out there on
this flight. And so, go out there and kind of check some of them out.
Yeah. Find more and read the book by Fuller. That's the stories by Ginny were from that book.
Yeah. There's also on YouTube, there is some short videos that are like a couple minutes long or a little more of some of the survivors, a couple of them stewardesses and talking about bits and pieces of, they survived and
terrifying, honestly.
Terrifying, but they survived. So check it out. Go take a look.
There's actually even an album from called The Three Hearts from musician Bob Welch. And he recorded a song entitled The Ghost of Flight 401. And that was in 1979.
There you go.
So
explore.
Yeah. I mean, for the people who were living in the late 70s who are old enough to remember this, this is a very iconic time for them. Plane crashes, thankfully, they do not happen very often, but when they do, we always remember them.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So thanks again for listening. Everyone, please, if you like what we do, please subscribe. Please leave us a comment. Please give us a rating. It really helps us out. And as always, stay ghosty, my peeps. Outside, the off lights blinked out.
There went the lights.
Right? I'm going to start over. He spent the morning working in his yard. In his yard.
Yeah, when we buy a house, I really want a front and backyard.
Right? Thank you for listening to the Paranormal Peeps podcast. You can find us on social media at Twitter at CPR Paranormal, on Facebook at Paranormal Peeps Podcast and Cold Spot Paranormal Research. And you can find us on Instagram at coldspot_paranormal_research.